Good morning, good afternoon, where you're located. This is Sturp Blumenthal with ETHOSystems. What we're going to be going over today is talking about importing and tips and tricks. It's funny, we have so many clients that are trying to import stuff in and bring in estimates and bring in projects and customers and journal entries. And we were talking about this internally, and we thought this will be a great training session. So it's my pleasure to introduce Carol, who is one of our awesome senior consultants who's going to be doing the training today. Carol, if you can go next slide real quick. Just from a logistics point of view, this webinar is 30 to 45 minutes. All the phone lines are muted. I am sorry about that, but it keeps it a lot easier. If you have any questions, use the little questions feature. I'm going to be monitoring that for Carol during the webinar. And if you do want a copy of the PowerPoint, please just put your name or email address in the questions feature, and I will make sure you get a copy of the PowerPoint. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carol, and she is going to talk about importing, because I think she has spent more hours importing projects in than anyone should at this point.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, for joining, and thank you for taking the time to get to learn a little bit more about Intacct, and also how to get data in Intacct, and also how to save time and have your employees go home earlier, hopefully, by using the importing features, so that they're not manually having to sit there and enter the data, manually one by one. So without further ado, I come up with 12 tips on how to import data in Intacct, and just some of the tips and tricks that we found along the way that have helped me tremendously. Number one, and unfortunately, I came about these the hard way, where I wasn't paying attention, or I just wasn't keen on the data, and I've learned, these tips and tricks along the way, and so I wanted to share those with you. They're not the whole list, but there's just a good start on how to import data cleanly and efficiently in the system, so that people can get on with the day-to-day tasks or operations within Sage Intacct. And so to get started, the importing data templates is what they're called. They are found under the company module in Intacct. And if you go to company and then go to setup, you're going to find them under this section called import data. That's where all the templates are stored or located. Now, before just a housekeeping thing, before a user can have access to even import the data, it's important that whether it's a business, whether it's the admin or somebody in the company, should be able to give them the right licensing and also the correct permissions, so that they can have access to the data. Just wanted to point that out. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to go through a few slides at a time, and then I'll kind of pause a little bit to ask a few questions to see if anybody has any question, and then we'll keep going. And then at some point I'll keep going and demonstrate each one of these tips as best I can in Sage Intacct. So an import data template, all that really means is a representation of what the user interface or what the front end of Intacct looks like. And all that really means is, if I wanted to go in and add a customer, for example, manually in Intacct, I can also do that using an import template. So the fields that you see, when I log into Intacct and I want to add a customer, are the same exact fields that are available on the upload template. So there's nothing there. One of the things with the upload template is that it looks so daunting, and it has so many columns, but then we forget that those same columns, and by columns I mean, column 1, which is customer ID here, is the same as customer ID, which is here. So, and then customer name, which is the second field here, is represented by the second column here, called customer name, if you will, on the template. So one of the things that I used to struggle with is when I would open an upload template, it would have maybe 100 columns. And I'm like, man, there's no way I would need 100 columns. And it looks so daunting at first because you don't know what data you need and which columns you don't need. But when you really compare it to the UI, it's the same thing. There's a lot of fields here that I'm not gonna add for a customer. I might not care for their URL. I might not care for their secondary email address. It's the same concept. And then those 100 fields are broken out into multiple tabs. So it's easier to ingest on the UI, and it can be a bit daunting, but it's not that hard. And I'm gonna showcase to you that it's really not that hard to use the upload template. So long story short, they are one and the same, whether you're adding it manually or using the upload template. Just wanted to call that out. And so on the 12 tips that I have is we're gonna go through each one of these is a tab, but they're all set up here. And if you want to get a copy of this, of the PowerPoint, then you can have them here. But we're gonna go ahead and get started, because number one, I'm excited. And number two, I wanna show you, spend the time in the system instead of calling them out. And so without further ado, for tip number one, when we want to load data in Intacct, and by data meaning, you want to load massive data. If you just want to add one customer, for example, we're going to use customer in this case as our example throughout all our tips. So if we wanted to add a customer in the system manually, that's easy to do. But if we wanted to load a detailed list of customers, let's say we're moving from Sage 300, for example, to Sage Intacct, and we wanted to load 100 customers or 1,000 customers, the upload templates are a really good way to load the same data over and over and over again. And so in this case, but before we get started, it's important to understand the columns requirements or Intacct's requirements, essentially. And this comes into two forms. We need to understand Intacct's requirements and also a client's requirements in this case. So for example, Intacct has a character limitation for each field. What this means, for the customer name, we cannot add more than 100. The length of the customer name is maxed at 100 characters. You can have a customer that has a longer name. It will just be cut off by Intacct at 100. So those are things that are important to remember. 100 characters is quite a bit, but it's important to understand the system requirement in that sense. The second requirement on top of characters is if the field is required by Intacct. In this case, for us to add a customer name, we need to have Intacct requires that the customer name cannot be blank. In this case, it is required right here, and they call it out, which is great. It's also the same thing when the name on to be printed also cannot be blank. However, there's a lot of fields that can be optional or not required. And in this case, Intacct does not require a customer's address to be a required field. However, this is a field that is required by the client in our example. So we are going to need to add it, not because Intacct requires it, but because the client requires that a customer have an address. That's one type of limitation in terms of the limitations of how long each field can be. The second requirement to understand is the nature of the field or the data type of the field. In this case, a customer name is what do you call it? It's a character value. It can be text in this case. The text can be a length of 100 characters. However, you can also have a credit limit, which is a number, is the limit for this customer 1,000 or 2,000. That calls for a number value. Or that is a customer active or inactive. In that case, that's a true or false. If the customer is active, then the value is T or true. And if the customer is not active, then the value is false. Here, you don't want to say yes or a no. You want to add a T for true or F for false. So it's important to understand the type of data that is required so that the importing process does not fail. Because it can be very frustrating when you get so many errors from Intacct. So it's important to understand what each column is calling for and then input the data in the Excel file as so. Then the third requirement that I don't like to overlook is, which is one of the most important ones, is the client required fields. A lot of these are oftentimes not required by Intacct, but they are required by the client. And so in this case, for example, for the Sage 300 customer ID, this is a field that is not required by Intacct, but the client does want data to be inserted in this field. A client can also require that we put in a sales or sales rep name in the customer, and so that becomes required by the client, but not by Intacct. So that's just tip number one, to understand each column's the nature of the data that we're adding and the nature of each field. That's step number one to a successful import file. On to tip number two. I kind of briefly mentioned this. It's important to also account for additional fields that when Intacct was provisioned for a client were not added. These are called custom fields. Intacct gives us the ability to add additional fields that pertain to a particular business or a nature of the business. So keeping it in line with a customer record, we would, and then let's assume we're moving from Sage 300 to Sage Intacct, it's important to add a custom field called Sage 300 customer ID, and this is where we would load those customers coming from Sage 300. This is where we would load what their unique ID was, so that we can use that field as a validation and confirmation that yes, we did load 100 customers from Sage 300 to Sage Intacct, and this is the one field that ties both of the systems out in that sense. So the beautiful thing is, once we add a custom field in Intacct, it should automatically be added to the import template for the customer records. And as you can see, it is in here. However, just in case something happens and it doesn't exist, it's also easy to add, and we just need to go find what the name is when we added the custom field, and we can just plug that name, which is this right here, on the import file, the Excel, and that works just as fine. Now, on the third tip, I hope I'm not going too fast. On the third tip is it's important to review and understand and accommodate SMART rule requirements. A SMART rule in Intacct, think of it as a guide or as a condition put in place, or a control put in place to make sure that data integrity is intact. What I mean by that is, if we're loading, let's say 100 customers or 1,000 customers from Sage 300 to Sage Intacct, the client might say, hey, I do not want to have any addresses missing when we're loading customers. And then Carol, I am not paying attention, and I happen to load a customer and I forgot to add the customer's address. That SMART rule put in place to not allow a record to be added will spit out an error saying, hey, I see one record, in this case here, Hoover Dam, the Hoover Dam as one of our customers, is missing address 1 and city, but it does have state and zip code. But as you can see, based on our SMART rule, we have to have address line 1 and the city and the state and the zip codes. Those fields cannot be blank. So the good thing about a SMART rule is it will tell you what's wrong when it was set up initially. So this will help. This is helpful because it lets us know what pieces we need to fix. And so in this case, then I would now come back to Hoover Dam and add an address and add a city, and then this record would now be standardized, and it would load the data that is required, if you will, by the client. So it keeps the data clean, it also keeps the data standardized, and it also keeps the data integrity in place based on this rule or condition. So I bring this up because this is important, because again, like I said, if somebody is just focused on adding data on the file and they're not paying attention to rules that have already been put in place, we will have a hard time loading the data because we have to accommodate for the SMART rules embedded in Intacct in that sense. So another tip to keep in mind. At this point, I'm just going to take a quick break and see if anybody has a question. And if not, I will keep going.
Nope, there's no questions at this time.
Okay, sounds good. Now on to tip number 4. it is very important to clean the data that we need to load in Excel first before we load it in Intacct. And by that, I mean things, removing things like double spacings, commas that are not needed, and also adding data that is missing in this example here, adding the data that is missing. It's just good to do a quick check and a quick look to make sure that, all the columns look good. We're not missing a customer's name. And so just to spend those extra few minutes just looking at the data. And one of the key things that I came about is if we add on the Excel file, for example, Cheesecake Factory as an example here, and I added extra spaces, as you can see here, when I go, this file will still load in Intacct, but when we load it, Intacct removes the extra spacings. And so if we were to try to validate this data from Intacct using a report to make sure that, our customers loaded, this would not tie because of these extra spacings. And so this can make you spend time trying to figure out why the record did not fail, because you're not going to get an error message, but you're not going to be able to tie it out. So doing this extra few minutes check to make sure that these things are taken care of will help in loading the data, first of all, and also validating that the data is correct downstream. And then on to tip number 5. This one I really like, and this one is really helpful for me because, and in this case, this is good when you want to add additional information to help understand what each column is asking for, but you don't necessarily want to load those descriptive columns. So this is moving away from a customer. Let's say we're loading a project in Intacct, and we're loading a lot of projects in using an upload template. In this case, I have an example of 2 projects here that I just made up. And one of them is linked to the Hoover Dam customer, and the other one is linked to the SoFi Stadium customer, for example. So we're looking at project ID and a project name and project category. These column headers up here, that might not mean much to somebody. And so let's say I'm used to adding a project manually in the system, and then all of a sudden I need to use an upload template to load the same data. I might not understand what these columns mean. So then what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna equate each one of these fields on the template to what I'm used to in the user interface on the front end when I'm used to adding a project or a job manually. And so this is me going in and saying, okay, on the Intacct, on the first tab called the Intacct tab or the project information tab, this is where I have the project ID. Okay, that's what that is. The project name, okay, those 2 are the same. That's why I add the project name, the project category. So this helps me tie out. And as you can see, this one says project _ description, but what I'm used to it's called description. So these columns are really helpful, whether it's on the row level and also on the column level. This one is great because, so in Intacct, I need the customer ID. Now, I don't know what the customer ID is, this C00145. I don't know what that is, but I do know what the customer is. And the customer is Hoover Dam and SoFi Stadium. So in this case, I'm gonna add an additional column on my Excel. And then I'm gonna bring in the list of customers, and I'm gonna select them from the drop-down list with the names that I'm aware of. And then I'm just gonna do a VLOOKUP to give me the ID. At the end of the day, Intacct doesn't care for this column. This is just for informational purposes. And so for me, to avoid deleting it, because it is now pulling a VLOOKUP on here, you just put the hashtag sign, and that when this file gets loaded in Intacct, it is ignored. So anything that has the hashtag on the columns or on the rows, those values will get ignored by Intacct, which is pretty awesome. So you still keep your original, but then you get to load what you really need. So I really, really like this feature. And then on tip number 6, now let's say we have all our customers ready. Now we're gonna go back to customers. Let's say we have our customers ready, all 100 of them. The data looks good, and we're ready to import them in Intacct. Now, this is what this is key. The file, so you're gonna save the file as it's already in an Excel, right? We reviewed our data in Excel, and then we copied over, we understood the columns, the ones that are required by both the client and Intacct, and we accommodated for the custom fields that we need, and we removed the extra spacings, and the data looks good to us as best as we can. At this point, we're going to go ahead and get ready to load the data. But before I load it, I wanted to show you what the upload template for a customer looks like. As I mentioned in the very beginning, it looks daunting, and it has 104. It has a count of 104 columns. But the funny thing, for me to load our 4 customers here, I only need 13 columns. So the rest of the 90 something remaining, or 80 something, we don't need, but they are applicable. It all depends on the nature of the client, or the nature of the customers that we need to load, and how much data we need to load. So it's always good to have all these additional fields. But so what I normally do, one of my features that I do is, once I'm going through each column, first of all, identify the length, so I'm aware of it. And secondly, the most important part is I identify whether the field is required. If it is required by Intacct, we have got to put data in it. If it is not required by Intacct, then my second question is, does a client require that data? And in this case, then I put in a note here saying yes, because of the SMART rule that we put in place for the address and the city and the state and the zip code. So those fields cannot be blank. But for the testing, we're going to leave the Hoover Dam one blank to showcase some of the error messages that we might get. Then on the custom fields that I had mentioned, here's a Sage 300 customer ID. We're pulling in from 300 to come into Sage Intacct so that we can confirm that our customers we loaded, and these are the customers that we loaded from the one system to another. Another field that is not required by Intacct, but it's helpful for a customer, is the terms. And then in case we require a rep, I added myself as the rep in this case for the testing purposes. And I also added a phone number. And it's also important to add a customer's email in case we want to send the billing through, in case we want to send the billings through email, the email address is helpful for that. But now, once I get my requirements, what I did is some of these fields were all the way to the right. So I literally just copied, I literally just cut, and I just moved the column over all the way to the left, because those are the fields that I care for. And for everything else, I went through each column and I confirmed that, okay, for what we're doing, do I need it? Do I not? In this case, I don't need the first and last names. And this template goes on and on and on all the possible fields that we can add. Now, remember, these are the same fields we can add manually on the front end. It's just that it's all spilled out on one spreadsheet. So in this case, I go in and I normally highlight blue for no as it's easier for me, and then red for yes. And that lets me know, number one, I've reviewed the column, and number two, it is not required, or I've deemed it not necessary for our load in this case. So I just go through on and on and on. Intacct just has a lot of options for us to put data into, which is great. We just don't need all of it. And so it goes on and on and on and on. And I'm just going to scroll over here just to show you. And I didn't even need touch these, because they don't even have the required or not required. So I didn't even touch those at all. And then towards the end here, we come back again, and I make sure I go all the way to the end. And then any other field, or let's say I forgot that we need a retainage percentage, I'm going to cut this column. And because I need it, I'm just going to come and bring it over here. That's essentially what I do. And if that's the case, then I can just do 10, for example, as a default, the 10% retainage, for example. Then at that point, let's say this is required by a client, then I'm just going to say, this is what a client required. That's how I review the template in the very beginning. And I promise you, if you do this right, the upload process will be very smooth. There we go. And that's how I changed that. And so if I say that, for example, this is what the upload template looks like. So now we have gone from 13 to 14 columns that we need. And then going back on here, now that we have our file ready, we're gonna save it, and we need to save it as a comma separated value format and not Excel. And just to show you on here, this is good because it lets you see the format type that it's being loaded as versus Excel. And if you, because I've forgotten myself to do this, and if we load it as an Excel, we're going to get this error right away saying, hey, file must end in CSV extension. So Intacct is pretty good to let you know that. And so then you go back and you save it as a CSV, and then you import it again, and life goes on. Any questions so far before I do the import?
So the only question that came in, and I answered it, was that the columns can be in any in any order.
Correct. Very true. You can move them around. Correct. Okay. And then now on to importing. So let's go ahead and import that file in Intacct. Let's have some fun, and then we will review the error messages. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come into Intacct. I'm going to log in, and we're going to go to accounts receivable. That's one of the places where our customers are located. And we're going to click on the customer dimension because we're loading for customers. And then this import option right here to the right. And then we can click on that. That's one way to access the imports. Another way to do that is to access the imports through where they originate, which is the import data under company, which was one of the first screens that we looked at. And if I click on import data, this is where all the upload templates live or that are stored. And if I was to look for customers, here it is. And this is where I found my template. And so if you click on template, it downloads. And then it's not going to look as pretty as this. And this is what the original template looks like. So, and this is where I now go in and start looking at, okay, that's required. Okay, this is not, that's not. And for all the ones that are required, that's why I start moving them, front and back and, back and forth. So this is what the original file looks like. And we're not going to save that, but let's go ahead and get ready to load this file. So you can either do it from the customers section with the import option at the right, to the right, or we can go to the upload, center and import it from here. Either way, they all work the same. So I'm going to go ahead and choose my file. And I'm going to select customers. And remember, there's two file formats. So there is the comma delimited value here. So that's the one I want. And I want to make sure it's a CSV, just that right there. And I'm going to go ahead and process it online so we can see what the error message looks like at first. So I'm going to click on import. Actually, let me demonstrate loading it as, okay. That's all right. Let me demonstrate loading it as a Excel so we can see the error message. And right there, there's a file must end in CSV extension. So I'm going to click OK and say, oopsie. Let me go ahead and select the CSV format. And then I'm going to click import. And because it was four customers, okay, so 3 loaded and 1 did not. At this point, moving on to the next tip is, well, I guess process offline is also works. So let me do this again and I'll demonstrate both ways. So that's one way, is to process online. And if we do it again, customer, import. And if we do it again, CSV. At this point, I can also process offline. This tip is really, really, really helpful when you're loading hundreds and thousands of lines, whether it's journal entries, projects, vendors, customers, entities, locations, anything that you're going to load multiple of records, or in the hundreds, or even 50 records, or even 20 records, and you don't want to keep doing that manually. This is recommended that we process offline. Number one, this does a few things. It allows you to, first of all, receive an email with the import results, which is this right here. And the email will include three things. The email will show you, will have an attachment of the files or the records that failed. That's number one. Number two, it will tell you the summary of out of 4 records, 3 was successful, 1 wasn't. And this 1 is what is included in this file. And number 3, it's going to show you the error message at the bottom of why this one record did not upload. So processing offline is beautiful in that sense. The second reason why I really like it is it allows you to keep working in Intacct as the files load in the background, because it just goes into a queue and it's processed as a first come first serve basis, if you will, behind the scenes. Versus the way we processed it here online, as you saw, it was literally hanging on this screen. And in other words, I had to wait for it to finish here, versus when I do this offline, I'm just going to go ahead and click import, and here's a process offline. And then with this email address, which I'm already set up in Intacct, it's going to generate that email to me. And so if I click import on here, you're going to get this message saying, hey, Carol, we're going to send you an email and notify you when the file is done. And that is, and then see, it allows me to go into Intacct, and I can go and add a job. I can go to, whatever else I want to do. I can keep working. That's a beautiful thing about processing offline. Now, the email that I will receive will be this one right here, where a few records were accepted and 1 failed. So process offline when you have a lot of records to upload. And on tip number 8, we got the error message. And so these are the 2 ways. So this is processing it offline. You get the error file in the email. When you process online, which is what we did at the first, we have to click on this download file here to get the error. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Otherwise, if you were to click out of this box, message box, you lose this file completely. So this allows you to see the report of the file immediately while within Intacct instead of being sent to you. But you run the risk of forgetting to download the error file. So in this case, it's not all bad, because you can always go into Intacct and run a report and see which customer did not load if you want to forget to click on this download file. But both of them either way, whether it's online or offline, both of them will still give you the same error message. And the way to decipher the error message, it's normally towards the bottom. And so the top part, like I showed, will give you, what records were uploaded successfully and which ones didn't. And at the bottom, you should see either one error message or 2 or 3 at the bottom. And so in this case, I normally just look for the wording after the description right here to hopefully tell me what the issue is. And in this case, it's a smart rule violation where we're missing an address or a city or a state or a city or a zip code for the one record that did not work. And so that now helps you go back to your file, and then ideally the one file that failed should only show Hoover Dam if you were to process offline. So these 3 would not be included. And then this is how you know, okay, I'm missing the address here and the city and the state, if you will. And so in this case, since we already uploaded our file, I wanted to show you what those records look like in Intacct for our 3 customers that loaded successfully. So then I'm gonna go back to accounts receivable, customers. And here they are. I have my Hyatt Regency, the JFK, and the SoFi Stadium, and I'm missing Hoover Dam because Hoover Dam is the one record that failed because it doesn't have the address or the city. But at least now I can fix that, and I only need to just upload that one record by itself, and I don't need to repeat these 3 anymore. And so that is how we can load records without having to go in and do this manually and then save it and then add it again, then save it and add another one and save it. The upload template is amazing for getting that, getting massive loads of data in Intacct loaded for us. Now, one of the smart rules I wanted to showcase here is if I was to add, for example, a test vendor very similar to the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam did not load because it's missing an address. But let's say I come in and I just add a customer here and I forget, and I just do just the customer name. The same smart rule is going to kick out and say, hey, you're still missing an address, a city, state, or a zip. And then I just go back and I add in address 123 Broadway Street. I'm just making it up. And then if I now save it, my test customer, oh, I forgot one thing. Give me a second. I had this as a view. I needed to add something so it populates on my screen. So the same smart rules or conditions put in place on the template also apply when we're adding that vendor manually. So in this case, those rules, that condition now allows all customers to always have an address in the system. Any questions so far?
No, I think you're good. I think you got about 4 minutes, so I think you're doing great.
Okay. And then we're almost done. And then this is another trick or tip that I found, and this is how to know which dimensions or records that can be updated. And so when you go to company, anytime you see an asterisk next to a name, that lets you know that the records can be updated using the same template. That's a really neat trick to know. It took me a while to figure that out. And so if we go back to company again, and we go to import data. So anything with an asterisk, which is the exchange rates, for example, vendors, customers, those will let you know that we can update the record. So for example, if we wanted to add another custom field for customers for, let's say, tracking a subcontractor's certificate of insurance expiration date, that's a custom field that we can add to track the date. But then let's say we need to update, the 10 or 15 or 20 or 100 subcontractors that we have. This now can allow us to update, make an update to those existing customers and add their dates in the system. So that's also another neat trick here. And then on one of the final tips for the journal entries, the journal entries, all the other tips apply for journal entries that we went through above, but the additional ones, because now we're loading numbers or values in the system, we have 3 that we have to accomplish, otherwise the journal entry file will not upload. And one of them is with the credit and the debit amounts need to be formatted in either a number or a text format, which is right here. And number 2, each row cannot have a value in each debit and credit. It has to be one or the other. So in this case, if you have 1,000 debit, the credit field needs to be blank, not even 0. It needs to be blank. And the same thing, if the value here for the revenue is 1,000, we cannot have a value in the debit field. Otherwise, if you do that, as you can see on this error message here, the Intacct will tell you, hey, that an amount needs to be either a debit or a credit, but it cannot be both. And then the third tip is the totals of the debits and credits must balance here. So if I accidentally have the money coming into this cash account and then the revenue is 1,100, that's not going to work because it's out of balance. So those are the 3 additional tips for journal entries to help us load the data successfully and keep on moving. And that summarizes the tips and tricks on how to use an import template, literally all of them. The same rules apply for all of them in loading massive data in Intacct in one swoop. And if you have any questions, I think this would be a great time to discuss.
I don't see any questions right now. I know there was a couple last slides we'll go through, but I don't see any questions right now. So we'll leave this open here. So obviously, there's.
Oh.
So there's one that just popped up on your screen in terms of comments.
Yep.
I don't know if you want to talk about comments being an issue.
So I briefly mentioned them in one of the slides here. Let me find it. Commas were, it was in the review, custom fields, smart roles. Right here, I mentioned the commas here too, sorry. So to remove the commas where not needed. It was part of the cleaning data. Commas can, it's important to try and reduce or even not have commas at all if possible. And I actually experienced this yesterday in the last few days, where commas were just not being accepted in Intacct. So if we can, when cleaning the data, if we can get rid of commas in names, or where you have like an LLC of some sort and just not have the commas would be recommended.
And I think the other one, sorry to interject here, the other character that sometimes has an issue is the ampersand sign. So that's something also to keep in mind. It's ampersand is sometimes kind of a behind the scenes can cause some issues. So, you know, if you have like, you know, S and B, you know, the ampersand, it's sometimes recommended to clean those up as much as possible. So
that's very true.
Perfect. So if you want to jump to slide 17 here, the only other, just a couple last things from us here at Ethos. We are going to be doing some more webinars. So the next one is on April 17th, Working Smart in Sage Intacct. We're going to be talking about some smart rules and having some fun with that type of stuff there. So that's going to be taught by Sue. We're all excited about that one. And then on the 12th of May, we're going to be setting up, talking about the ACH process within Sage Intacct. We've got people already signed up, so please register in advance. It requires, with GoToWebinar, you have to register in advance. So if you can please register these in advance, that would be great. Moving forward, we will, if there's any other webinars that you would be wanting us to hold, we will be holding those. We will probably have one this summer when some of the newer features come out. We're waiting for the Q2 release that's supposed to have some of the new billing aspects as well as the AIA billing releases. So we're excited about that. So we'll be doing a webinar on that. And then we'll also be doing another webinar sometime this summer on the new real estate module that's coming out. So we're excited about that. So lots of cool stuff coming out from Sage Intacct, and also the payroll module. So yeah, there'll be lots of webinars this summer and come in fall with all the new features that Sage is adding along the way. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, Sir Blumenthal, or to Carol. Again, Carol, phenomenal job, great job putting this together. I know you were up late last night trying to get all this PowerPoint and get all this working, so I really appreciate you putting this together and doing a great job. Thank you so much, and we just got another response from the audience saying thank you, great job. So if you have any questions, let us know. We will be posting our videos on this video on YouTube in the next day or two. And you can also go to our YouTube channel to check out all our videos. With that, thank you everyone for today's time.